And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm actually broadcast. Having this broadcast today from the city of Ballarat, the land of the Jarrah people, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the past, the present, and the future, and also acknowledge that their struggle was also a struggle for liberation and against colonialism, and believe that their struggle is part of our broader struggle today against imperialism and against the bosses. I'd like to actually introduce some comrades today. We've got Jay Tharapple from Sydney. Welcome aboard. How are you going up there?
Nice to meet you, Luke.
Yep. And
How's it
also
going, mate?
introduce another friend and comrade, Luke Martin, who's actually the Secretary of Bendigo Trades Hall, who's also down here at Ballarat, where obviously be at the Eureka celebrations tomorrow. How are you going, comrade?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for inviting me on.
And then there was, and also once again another good friend and comrade, Joe Montero, who myself, along with Jay, we've been working on this Australians for a New Democracy. So it's similar to a Centre of Political Innovation, a think tank, that's in the process of being developed. How are you going today, Joe?
I'm good, doing great, and it's great to be here. And also, I'll meet you guys in a few hours. Certainly, I must be in Ballarat before 4 a.m.
Oh,
anyway,
right.
That's the plan.
Well, the purpose tonight's live, and well, a big shout out to everyone that will either watching now or will be seeing this later on. Tomorrow is a very significant, very important date in our history. It's the 167th anniversary of the Eureka Stockade battle. It was a battle that culminated in quite a number of years of rebellions against the colonial authorities. It was unfortunately led in bloodshed on the 3rd of December in 1854. And obviously, for that, it never ended there either. Obviously, it was a broader struggle against colonial oppression and obviously for our own national liberation as well in the long term, which is still, in a lot of ways, should be still continuing today. And it wasn't just everything happened here in Ballarat that year. There was many years of struggles, both from the early comic struggles, the First Nations struggles, right through to the various goldfields rebellions, which actually pretty much kicked off in 1851 in Chewton in Castlemaine there with the start of the monster meeting. It wasn't just about fighting against the tax. It was actually fighting about the whole system itself and challenging authority. So it is a significant date. So we thought we'd do this live before on the eve of the anniversary, and that's right. 4 o'clock tomorrow morning will be the start of the dawn service, if you want to put it that way, or ceremony of the actual battle at where the stockade did take place. We will be there, myself, Luke, and Joe. That's what time it actually happened in the morning as well, around about that time. So that's just sort of a roundup for that. But we'll have to open up, and obviously we'll have a formal discussion about this. And look, if anyone is watching and listening, please feel free to ask any questions or make a comment. We'll certainly try to address that. And so we'll open up. And look, first of all, Joe, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd start off by saying that the Eureka Rebellion was one of the big influences of my life. I got to know about it when I was still pretty young, and through the years, I did try to find out as much as I could about it. And one thing I think sometimes is forgotten is the influences behind that. This happened at a time when there was just about everybody had come from overseas. They'd come from Europe. There were some others, but first of all, there was rebellion in Europe against the old monarchy. So it was a Republican era. There was also in the UK, this was the time of the rise of the Chartists, the movement that gave rise to the trade union movement in the UK and here. And there was also a wish for a different kind of life, not the old type of society. A lot of people came here because it wasn't so much to find gold. There might have been part of that, but people came here because they wanted to get away from the old class structure that they saw or that they lived back in the old country. Here, they found there was a smaller group of people who control the land, control the politicians, work with the British banks and mill owners, and suppressed everyone else. And that's where the taxes came in. So there was that sense of class struggle. There was also a time, and I would argue this was the birth of multiculturalism in this land, because the people came from all over the place. You know, there were Asian people there who participated, some well, particularly Chinese. There were even, I understand, a few Afghanis. Another influence was, of course, there was a group of African Americans who had gone through the period of, it hadn't quite happened, but the rise of the anti-slavery movement in the United States. Now, all this is important because it fell into the melting pot. And I nearly forgot, because a big component were the Irish Republicans. They had a tremendous influence as well. So it shaped the identity. When the rebellion was actually crushed, and they picked 4 o'clock in the morning because a lot of people had gone to see their families and so on before they came back. But the support for them was so intense around Victoria and the rest of Australia that when the people they captured went to trial before Sir Redmond Barry, notorious, he's the bloke that hung Ned Kelly, that there were so many people gathered at the court or outside the court, only a few got inside. Over half of the population of Melbourne, over half, were there. And the court was forced to let them go, because otherwise the place would have been an open rebellion. They were talking about revolution that time. The consequence of that, of course, it changed political history. And I think the Eureka Rebellion was what led to a series of events, of course, influenced the trade union movement, but it led to self-government, because republicanism or being free of the British Crown was a key demand at Eureka. And it happened with federation. There is some unfinished business. This tradition has lived on, and every particularly working class struggle since 1854 has carried the emblem of Eureka. There's been a conscious understanding that we're continuing this struggle. And I think that's the relevance of today. We still got the British Queen. We still got a lot of things that need to be changed in this country, and that's what it represents. That's why we need to honour it.
Thank you, Joe. And also, too, I'd like to once again introduce Luke Martin. He's the Secretary of Bendigo Trades Hall, which we're only just over an hour away, and was also a very historical site for the Red Ribbon Rebellion, which led up to Eureka as well. So, Luke, would you like to have a talk on this as well?
Yeah, sure. So, like Dave's put it out, so this all started back in 1851 when it first the proclamation was went out to increase a license tax. Which we know the license tax was all about getting people off the gold fields and back into the service of the aristocracy in Melbourne, and it was just a taxation without representation. But it all began when the miners first come together in Chewton, 15th of December 1851. There was a monster meeting of about 15,000 miners. And it grew from there. And Bendigo is the home of the Red Ribbon Rebellion. Now, this all could have happened on those goldfields at that time, but the workforces there were so well organised that they actually they ruled the law of the land there, and so the governor couldn't quite sort of break their spirit enough to see what happened on Eureka. And I think what had happened is that they got a little bit smarter. So when Eureka come round, they were one step ahead. They seen how organised labour can break them, and they organised around that, and they got ahead of it, and that's where it all ended bloodshed. but this is like, it was events that really sparked the union movement in Australia, and it's like we hold it very proud, this history, and it's our history. We've got to own it and we've got to reclaim it, and it needs to be. We need to pass it on. I feel that there's a lot of this history is actually sort of been buried a little bit, and it's our responsibility to dig it back up and pass it on to the next generation, so we don't see a repeat of history. So.
Very good, very good. Jay, did you like to make a comment?
Other than to say that for me, the importance of the Eureka Stockade is that Australians were pledging allegiance to an Indigenous, well, not an Indigenous in the sense of Aboriginal, but to a national symbol, the Eureka flag that has its roots in this country, as opposed to what we currently have, which is a flag that has the flag of another country on it. And so we shouldn't be surprised when our rulers behave as if Australia is merely a subsidiary of Britain and a lackey of the United States. And you see that, for example, in the way that Julian Assange is being treated. It's like it's perfectly okay for an Australian citizen to be treated that way because we are merely subsidiaries of the United States. I think that entire notion, or in that case it was Britain, that entire notion of Australia being merely an extension of some other country was broken. And that for me is the significance of the Eureka flag.
Yeah, and actually, when I learned about this when I was a young boy, and I was actually very fortunate in how I came across Eureka. It was actually when I was in year 6 in primary school, and our primary school did a school play on the Eureka Stockade and the Rebellion. Funny enough, I played at a British officer called Major General Nichols. But my fascination with Eureka ever since. And from there on just grew and grew, and the whole history of it. Now, there's the official history. It was only a battle a short time. There was protests leading up to it. It really, by rights, when there was a lot more research into the matter, it was actually a movement overall. And as I just stated at the start of this film, it was an accumulation of many events leading up to it, and even thereafter as well. And I'd actually like to recommend to everyone both watching and maybe want to send some comments. I would recommend there is a YouTube program. I think there will be a series of them called Death and Liberty, or Death or Liberty, which is actually the struggles of that earlier period in Australia, from the convict struggles to the Irish struggles, etc. And funny enough, and it was just mentioned before, most of the people transported here, either against their will or trying to get away from it, were either Chartists, you correctly pointed out, Irish rebels, but we also had revolutionaries from France, Germany, Italy, around the world, and people that were actually struggle against some sort of dominant power. Interesting, right through the goldfields here, and you look at cities like Ballarat and Bendigo, a lot of it's German design. Why? Because a lot of Germans came here after 1848, 1840s revolutions in Germany against the aristocracy and feudal order. They were fighting for to fight for a unified nation. Obviously, they were fleeing political and religious persecution. They came here, and that's why we have such Lutheran sections in the cemeteries, and you have common names like Miller, which is an anglicised version of Mueller around, the German club. So they actually played a huge role in all that. And these are the sort of people that would have fought alongside shoulder to shoulder with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in all that time. So obviously there was that tradition coming in from Europe as well. And I've always said it. One thing, and earlier in my own videos, I've always said it would have been a hell of an army. We've had the Indigenous, the rebels, and even many other people. It would have been one hell of an historical army, and would have been for a really good purpose as well. And I think what, for me, it means today as well, look, this struggle has to continue. We're seeing a state of affairs in Australia. It's not benefiting any working, common, ordinary people at all. A lot of people are suffering. Yes, there has been COVID, but there's also the economic situation really suffering there. And people have no control over the direction this country has at all. It's more than just being at a ballot box trying to elect whoever's in Parliament. I think overall people are feeling that sense of helplessness in the whole lot. And I think something we've got to learn from this experience of the 1800s, this tradition has to continue. We have to take it even further and realise we've got to be organised. It's common, ordinary people that have to be organised and prepared to fight to take it to make this a better society. And that's funny enough. That's what my grandparents said to me a long time ago. We came into this world as we thought we want to leave it as a better place, and obviously that sort of tradition to keep it going. That's what we want to do for Australia as well. And yeah, there's some sort of national feel to it as well, but I think there's also an international feel to it because it was people from all around the world. And just on that, I'm going to throw it out there because I know there are some other groups that tend to distort Eureka. I won't mention the actual particular names. Well, I think we're all familiar and well aware of it. But I did feel there is a distortion of using the Eureka flag itself and what it meant for what its whole purpose was. I just want to get some comments off yourselves. Joe, did you want to make any comment on that?
Yeah. I just a couple of things because there are, and I understand if they're the people you're talking about, some of the sort of Nazi fascist groups are actually planning to have their own thing in Ballarat on Sunday. Now, I think we need to bring out, that's why I think the multiculturalism thing is important because they don't agree with this at all. And I reckon we need to mention Raffaello Carboni. He was the second official, the second person there, Eureka, after Peter Lola. He was the strategist, but he was also the historian of Eureka because he wrote a book about it. And it's important because he was not the sort of British person coming out here. Obviously, the name, he was Italian, but he was also one of the leaders of the Republican movement under Garibaldi that actually unified Italy for the first time. So he was in the thick of that. And immediately after that, he came here to Australia. He ended back in Italy again later on. But he certainly wrote the sentiment down. And it's this question of unity. There's a lot of stories about Indigenous people also being involved in some way in the whole Eureka thing too, right? So it was a thing of creating a new kind of Australia with people from all over the place, a new kind of society here. And also that Eureka really, I think, gave birth to talk about socialism here. It's where it emerged from.
Yeah, Luke, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. We too often see that the Eureka flag has been misclassified as some sort of a nationalist symbol, and it couldn't be any further from, like, as previous comments from others have been, it was very much a multinational struggle and also a multiple class struggle. Every single person on the goldfields in those times had to present a license, otherwise they were unfairly treated and discriminated against. And that was whether they were looking for gold or running a shop. So it actually affected everybody. So the flag represents multinational unity under one struggle. They all come together to help each other out and fight against a common cause. You know, it is so unfair to see these neo-Nazis and various other groups walking around with the Eureka flag flying high and proud, and then talking about white power and really putting a very racist spin on it. It's got nothing to do with nationalisation of the people. It's a union symbolisation for a class struggle and multinational struggle, and that's what it is. So.
Very good. Jay.
On the other side of it, the fact that this is a flag that has respect on the left wing and the right wing among socialists and communists on one hand, and fascists and Nazis on the other hand, kind of proves that it's earned the right to be Australia's national symbol if people across the board agree with it. Now, of course, it is up to socialists, of course, right? It's up to socialists, of course, to claim that flag with ideology by giving that flag meaning. And what I would add to what's been said is that I believe that after the Eureka Stockade Rebellion, there was a concerted effort to treat white Australians as belonging to Britain. You know, it's like, instead of treating white Australians as like, okay, well, you're just cast off former convict scum and we don't like you, the attitude is to say, no, you're actually part of the British nation, and you should feel good about yourself. And the way we're going to instill a sense of pride in you is to make you hate anyone who's not white. And so that way you're able to kind of diffuse and divide and rule the entire spirit of Eureka to begin with.
And that's right. I mean, when we learned about this, and it was, you could say it was a struggle of popular unity against a common foe. I'll quote this. I love this little saying. You broaden the base, you narrow the target, and I think that's what it is. It's not there to promote a particular race or whatever. It's actually there to actually one way it's a flag of liberation, really, when you look at it, national liberation from a particular oppressor, and that's what I looked at Eureka as. I wouldn't equate it to others like the Stars and Stripes or anything like that. Nothing like that at all. It was a genuine flag against oppression and for our own national liberation. The other point too is to be made, and that I'd like to actually emphasise. Unfortunately, it has been used by the far right for various dubious purposes, and it's not what that actually means at all. Far from it, because it said a lot of people from various different backgrounds brought under that flag too at that time, and even thereafter. It was interesting because when you were mentioning before, because even though that period right up to the Federation to form Australia in 1901. There was many struggles. I mean, you had from the shearers' strikes, you've had miners' strikes, you had waterfront strikes. So there was, you had the industrial side of it as well. But people still had to rally and fight for just some basic needs and that. And I mean, out of it, yes, out of Eureka and out of the Goldfields rebellions, we did. First of all, one step forward was receive male suffrage, because prior to that, no one had a right to vote except if you were landed squattocracy, top military brass, or you're high up in the colonial authorities. No one had the right to vote. And it took at least women another half a century for them to achieve the vote as well. And we should actually keep that in mind too. They had to struggle even more to fight for the vote, but still struggle in this day to have equal rights at the workplace as well, and amongst many other areas as well, inside and outside of the workplace, I should say. And so, and even that, it took well over another 100 years for Indigenous people or First Nations people to be finally addressed to being citizens. And remember, when you mentioned there being appendage of Britain, it was funny, for a very long time, even after we federated as a nation in 1901, our national anthem was "God Save the Queen" or "God Save the King," and it turned into the Queen. And we were actually known as British subjects, or the Queen's subject, or the King's subjects for many years, not Australian citizens. And that I remember my mum and dad was telling me about. That's what they used to sing at school. Was God Save the King or God Save the Queen. And it depends on what year you were born. Prior, it was King George or Queen Elizabeth. And from there on. So really by rights, and even that even just with our accents, they tried to actually make us speak more British. And some people said some Australians spoke better British English than Brits themselves. And I thought, well, that it comes to show that was also a struggle for our own national identity as well, our own cultural identity, which is something still strong, and I think that needs to have a good, thorough look at. Joe, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, trying to get Australians to speak like the British didn't really work. So, but I think it's one of the most important things is that spirit that emerged from Eureka. A lot of the miners who went there were originally miners. Of course, after that, they drifted back to places like Melbourne, and a lot of them became leaders. the founders of unions, the founders of other, community, mass organisations, battled for and had that fight in them still to battle for lots of things. By the 1880s, Australian working class people in Australia had the highest standard of living in the world. Wages were higher, working conditions were better. We got the first 8-hour day. These are some of the things that would not have happened if it was not for Eureka. And
exactly,
they understood that. The problem is we need to understand that now, and people do. And one of the problems we face in Australia that there's been constantly, originally trying to rewrite history, that it was somehow different, that it was a history of just racist white people. Is one example. There are a few of those, but there was actually much of the opposite as well. More recently, and it's really in the education system, it's really strong to deny history. History didn't happen. So young people today going through school quite often, unless their teachers squeeze it in, and I've been able to do that sometimes in the past, that they know nothing about it. They know nothing about the past. The past comes, history starts with Hollywood. And that's what's got to change. And we've got to develop an understanding of our own history, understanding where Australia come from and the real nature. And we've got to develop a culture with it. Well, we had it, and it's still there, but it's buried. It evolves. It won't be exactly the same, but we've got to pay attention to that. And there's got to be an identity. One thing that union people understand quite well, to get the membership together, to get people, wanting to do stuff, wanting to fight the battles, they've got to be proud of who they are. If you don't have pride in who you are, you're defeated before you start. So we've got to work on that one still.
Luke.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there, Joe. This was almost the kickstart of democracy in Australia, and we actually seen working class people selected by their peers to represent them in Parliament. We've seen a number of those people involved in those early rebellions actually elected into government, and were some of the first representatives of the people. One comes to mind in Bendigo, Robert Clark, who was part of the Red Ribbon Rebellion. He went on to become a member of the Legislative Council, and he was the first to legislate the 8-hour system for the mines. And then we've got your union leaders. They all come from the same struggle, that same background. And we see the need for organised labour. So then our unions started popping up left, right and centre. And then they all come together, and this is where we got the trades halls from. We've got 3 of the oldest trades halls in the world here in Victoria. And all come from that era. It really did kickstart our democracy and the representation of the working classes.
Jay.
And I believe that the Eureka flag is banned on work sites, isn't it?
In Victoria, yes. Technically, yes.
Yeah.
There are some ways to sneak it around.
Yeah. Well, that just shows me that the Eureka Revolution is incomplete. They were successful insofar as they were able to get rid of, essentially colonial absolutism, where it's just like whatever the governor says is law, and move towards like more democracy, more representation. But they were never successful in actually overthrowing the state and establishing a new revolutionary state. And I think that's where the United States is ahead of ahead of Australia now. Regardless of what you think about the Revolution of 1776, they had slavery and everything. But the thing is, they were able to get rid of British rule and become a separate country. Now, here in Australia, that is yet to happen because we're still under the monarchy. And I think for that reason as well, the Eureka flag represents that kind of a that kind of a subversive threat to the establishment that still sees itself as being tied to Britain and by extension the United States, or more so these days, it's the United States. And we never seem to think of ourselves as having independent interests of them. I remember one example of this. I was watching John Mearsheimer, and he's an American geostrategist. He came to Australia, and he was giving a talk on what he believes our position should be on China. And he basically said, if you go with China, you become our enemy. You are then choosing to become an enemy of the United States. And he also said that you will sacrifice prosperity for security, thereby admitting that Australia has an interest in normal trade relations with China. I think we need more protectionism, but normal trade relations with China generally benefits Australia. He accepts that, but he's saying you're going to do this because you don't want to underestimate how nasty the United States can be to Australia. And to my shock, the audience laughed. They thought it was funny. They thought it was funny for this American to come here and threaten our country in that kind of way. Now, despite the fact that I was born in a different country, but obviously I've been socialized by Australia and raised by Australia, I felt offended as an Australian. And I think we need to do more of that. When we see Julian Assange being tortured by the British, we should say, I'm offended as an Australian. This is an affront to my Australian sensibilities. And we don't hear enough of that because we think that if Julian Assange is being persecuted and tortured by the British and the Americans, then that's okay because they're like big brothers or something. But that mentality has to go. And that's the thing. If the Eureka flag can come to represent an independent Australian will, then I think that has immense potential to gain a popular following here in this country.
Yeah, I think if I could jump in here a bit, because I think there's that issue that came up particularly with Federation, that within the Republican, well, not so much Republican, but the Federation forces, the pro-Federation, there were two sides to that argument. And there was those who were able to, in a sense, compromise with the UK. Leading up to that, there were a series of conventions that a lot of people were involved in discuss. So there was widespread discussion of what should happen. And there were a lot of good things put forward and accepted by most people. But when the negotiators got to negotiate, and that was part of the problem, because the view of those forces was they accepted that Federation would have to be an act of the British Parliament. So when it came down there, it actually got watered down. And some of the key things were taken out of there. Now, one of them was actually the Eureka flag. The Eureka flag, the popular sentiment and the decision of the conventions was that the Eureka flag would be the new flag of the new nation. The British Parliament said, oh, we can't have that. We can't have that. So they said, well, at the very least, you're going to put our flag, the British flag, on the corner, something that some people down south now call it the butcher's apron. I reckon it's a good name. But anyway, the butcher's apron on the corner, and distort the Southern Cross on it, make it sort of stylise a bit and make it look a bit different. And that's what the British Parliament agreed to, which is the flag we've got now. So it's not the be-all and end-all in itself, but it does symbolise that in the forces to develop an independent nation, there was an internal struggle, which is still there. It still hasn't been resolved.
Yep, exactly. Still exists.
And if I can just jump in, I think part of the reason for that, and this is if you look at it from, look at Australia's history within the context of the broader British Empire. Within the British Empire, there were extractive colonies and settler colonies. Australia was a settler colony. A country like India, where I was born, was an extractive colony where wealth was extracted from. And I think part of the reason why, this compromise of Australia remaining under Britain while having like the structures of an independent dominion, gaining dominion status, for example, later on, that represented the fact that on balance, Australia did benefit from the extraction of wealth from other parts of the world. And so to a certain extent, maybe the Australian population was bought off. in the sense that they, as you said, Joe, they had the best living standards in the world, because of a lot of the concessions that they had won. I mean, they had struggled for and won. But when you have like a resource-rich country like Australia with plenty of gold and soil and wealth for toil for everyone, that becomes possible. And that's when there's no other way around it. But if you if you I think part of the reason why it becomes like a symbol for a lot of like racists is because they say, well, we want to keep this all for ourselves. Like we don't want any non-whites to have it. But then the point there is that, first of all, that agenda is not going to work because so many white Australians are integrated into non-white communities. They marry across cultural lines. And so for that reason, it's going to be very hard to convince like the majority of white Australians that they should suddenly like sever themselves from anyone who's not white. And so I don't think they're going to succeed. But there is, I think, some truth in the sense that a lot of them will push this idea that Australia was better in the past because it was whiter. It was better for workers, like let's say, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then the Accord comes in and then things just start to get worse and worse. Australia was better for workers in the past and Australia was whiter, but it wasn't because Australia was whiter that Australia was better for workers. It's because people from a variety of different cultures, as you've already mentioned, came together and said that Australia had an independent destiny that was separate from the interests of Britain. Now, I think Britain had an interest in maintaining the value of its currency because the British pound sterling is a gold standard currency. And so if Australia has lots and lots of gold, I mean, Australia did have a gold rush, Britain would want to ensure that as much of that gold is captured into the British financial system in order to back the value of the pound sterling. And so when you have a group of Australian patriots saying, no, the gold stays here, it's going to be used to develop the local economy, that worries Britain because they're a resource poor island and they need both of their colonies. They need the extractive colonies like India, which is like where most of the plunder came from, but they also need to ensure that gold is being siphoned out of Australia in order to back up their financial system. And so an independent Australia would undermine that. And if I could just add, an independent Australia would probably also undermine the interests of the United States. I mean, 80% of our mining profits goes to the US. Now, why isn't that a national demand? I mean, nationalizing the banks and mines should be a demand that falls under the Eureka flag because we want to be an independent country.
Exactly.
Bit of misdirection going on.
I mean, without for a start, having control of the financial system, you can't have national sovereignty because you don't control your economy.
Yep.
You haven't got a chance of actually doing much with it. So, and we've actually gone south in that respect rather than improve over the years.
Exactly.
So it's really something we need to look at. Although I have to say, I don't quite agree that Australians or early Australians benefited from the exploitation of people of other nations. I think later on there might have been some elements of that. I mean, Australia basically supplied wool to the British, a bit of wheat, a few other things, and mainly gold. I mean, gold at that time became the most important, as for the reason that Jay mentioned. The highest standard of living was won by struggle, and also some sections of capital, particularly in Victoria, when being knocked out, they were blocked from actually advancing themselves, of setting up their own businesses. They couldn't get finance very easily, because the banks were controlled by the British. They wanted to just export resources to there. And so they actually, particularly in Melbourne, actually made some concessions with the unions. They worked together and that was a big part of actually in gaining the 40-hour week and a few other victories. And that was really an example of uniting different forces for common demand.
Mm.
And it worked much better than it did in New South Wales. In New South Wales, there wasn't that sort of unity. And New South Wales actually lost its position as the leading economic city of the new nation. It went to Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was a lesson for them. And consequently, New South Wales for a long time was much more of an agricultural economy than Victoria was.
Yeah.
Victoria's where industry started up.
Very much. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well,
and it includes places like Bendigo and Ballarat, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, because actually that's what we saw, the development of industry, especially after, it wasn't just after Eureka, but especially accelerated World War One, showed that we needed industry. But we still even then had to actually ask permission from British banks and the Privy Council to start up our own steel industry. It just shows you how ridiculous the situation was, and we were still using the Privy Council for many years to make the final decisions for if something had to be taken through the court system, be it some sort of legislation, etc. The Privy Council, based in London, there to make the final decision on a country that's got really nothing to do with them at all. And it comes to show it's actually still a struggle to this day. It's about power, and power for which class. And I think, for that, we do have we should have a coalition of popular unity led by the working class. And I think we do need to get this country on its proper independent course. So interesting, myself and Luke were talking earlier today about the head of state, because obviously the Queen's sick. There's all sorts of stories floating around. But I mean, obviously. And I mentioned that back in Perth, I was listening to a talk by Peter Fitzgibbon, who was actually, I think, a journalist for the Age and Sydney Morning Herald. But he was pro-Republican. He loves Eureka, and I mentioned about other struggles as well. He was interested, but he says, I mean, when you hear the excuses, I'll just wait till the Queen passes away, then we'll have the discussion. And he says, aren't we that mature enough and grown up enough to actually have this discussion now and move forward? We wait for a head of state to pass away, and just because all of a sudden we'll have King Charles instead. And it just comes to show that we shouldn't be afraid. It's, look, regardless of who the head of state is, we need to have this discussion now. And really to move forward, that we want to actually have control of our own affairs again. And that's what it comes down to. What we've seen with what's happened with COVID, what's happened with the world economy, everyone's disillusioned, whatever. It's because we got that sense of no control and isolation from our matters. And I think that's what happens. It requires, it's an easy thing to say, we need to be organised, but we need to actually get control of our own destiny again. And which way we want to take Australia forward, not where the multinationals and the big corporate sector, such as international finance and international banks and all that, need to tell us where to go. We said no more. We want to take Australia in this way, and that's got to be obviously the discussion and the struggle ahead for all of us. Because at the moment it's not that happening. But out of this, I think that's what Eureka means for me anyway today, but hopefully for many other people. Well, we need to actually take matters back in our own hands and forge our own destiny again. Not rely on hopefully the next great person comes into Parliament and does all the work for us. We need to actually, and it shows we need to have that struggle on the ground again, like we did in the past. I know the time's starting to go away, and I think, Jay, you need to get going very shortly, and a couple others as well. And plus, me and Luke want to just do the typical Aussie thing and go to the pub and have a couple of beers. So must do. But look, I also too, for all the viewers, look, thank you for coming along tonight. I also recommend this book if you can get your hands on it. Eureka and Beyond by Monty Miller. Monty Miller played a very historical role. He was born in 1834 in Tasmania. It was then known as Van Diemen's Land. He was sold into apprenticeship servitude, which was quite common at that time in Sydney as an apprentice carpenter, and he was treated very cruelly by his master carpenter the time he lived with, but he was consistently beaten with a knotted rope and treated very poorly, paid no wages, so he escaped. That's what happened. Actually, that's what the early police used to do, is go hunting for, that's what they used to do, hunt for escaped apprentices. And he hit what is now the Hume Highway, but was an old Bullock team truck, and teamed up with a Bullock team and headed to Victoria looking for his parents. Came to Melbourne, then over to Port Fairy, came back and realised his parents were back in Melbourne, but he worked as a shepherd out. Now it's actually a holiday getaway. It's called Campaspe Downs near Mount Macedon. He worked there for a while, and then obviously the gold rush headed off, and he went to seek a much better way of life, and he headed up to Forest Creek where the monster meeting started. And he mentioned that. He mentioned the Red Ribbon Rebellion of Bendigo 2 years later, but he headed down to Eureka or Ballarat, and he actually fought in the Eureka Stockade. He's now buried in Karrakatta Cemetery. He passed away in 1920 in Karrakatta in Perth there. It's actually part of the cemetery tour. You can actually go there because I know that for a fact. I was on the subcommittee to actually mark his grave and have a memorial plaque in the memorial gardens. It's a very historical character, and there's about 14 veterans of the Eureka Stockade area buried in Western Australia. So it comes to say that it was quite a very historical event, very big event. I highly recommend his breeding. He was a very he was especially a revolutionary. He was the industrial workers of the world. He led the anti-conscription struggles in World War One, and when he passed away at 88 years of age in 1920, so certainly even John Curtin tipped his hat off to him, recognised he was a man of great worth as well for what he did and dedicated to the working class and the common people. Look, I'm going to
could also mention the Monty Miller was also at that time during the anti-conscription days. I think during the First World War, he was actually arrested and brought before the court and was expecting to get a jail sentence, but they didn't dare.
Wow.
So it didn't go to prison.
Incredible. Look, I'd like to thank everyone tonight. I'd like to thank Jay, Joe, and Luke for participating with this panel discussion tonight. We're looking forward to do more of these. But look, tomorrow is the 167th anniversary. If you're here in Ballarat, there will be we've got a ceremony at 4 o'clock in the morning. Actually, when it did start, we'll go 4 to 6, and I believe during the day, don't quote me, I think it's at 10 o'clock. There's another service at the mass grave in Ballarat Cemetery as well. And obviously, throughout the weekend, there's the Eureka Museum may be holding a few events and webinars as well. So keep your eye open, really important. And look, I also want to thank all the viewers as well commenting tonight. Just one of the viewers here from the US. Yes, I am using Dust James's channel. How that came to be, we discussed about it. We're going to be using StreamYard. This is what we use now. What it is, we've upgraded, so both myself and Dust are admins to this account, so we're able to then broadcast using both our Facebook and YouTube channels, etc. So there was some confusion about that. I was hoping this does work. And once again, look, a big shout out to everyone that viewed tonight, and thank you very much. And look, once again, we'll see you, Joe and Luke, tomorrow. And Jay, take it easy, and we'll see you in for Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
See you.